Hi guys, I have my mic up pretty high and I'm hoping that it's not going to be too loud. I've been experimenting with the sound. By the way, it's the North Woods Fairy. My name is Kat. And I'm kind of wired right now because if you don't already know, I'm a truck driver. The big truck. Yes, the big trucks. And I have another page. I can post a link to that page. I actually have a decent amount of subscribers, not like 334 or whatever. Yeah, something like that. And it's not like a lot, but it's more than I ever thought. But anyways, so if you're interested in finding out more about me, you can check out that channel. So I'm gonna come in closer to the mic. It picks up a lot of sound. I actually had to put my dog, who's a German Shepherd, named Lagatha, if you've ever watched the show Vikings. Lagatha is a shield maiden who is with the main character Ragnar. She's actually one of the main characters too, and she's just really awesome. Like, a shield maiden is a woman that fights alongside men. They were believed to be just as good or better than the men. And Lagatha is known as she was definitely as good as the men. So, yeah, my dog's name is Lagatha, and that's spelled Lagertha. Nobody knows how to say it. It's like, why did I name my dog that? Who knows? But anyways, so another thing I wanted to say is that I am really wired. I think I already said that. I'm really wired from work. I drink coffee. I was working second into third. I work part-time because I'm a new mommy. And so it's gonna be one heck of a day tomorrow. I don't know how much sleep I'm gonna get. That's okay. There's a book I've been wanting to read, and I figured it would be killing two birds with one stone, because I got this book when I used to team drive. And I'll explain that real quick. It's when you truck drive and you have a team, like you have someone you drive with. Usually people do that when they start out. They do it to get experience, and team drivers are to get, you're only allowed to drive a certain amount of hours. So if you team drive, one person sleeps while the other person drives, you can drive a total of 11 hours within a 14-hour window. I used to team drive. It's not always that much driving, like the whole 11 hours, but I would, when I wasn't sleeping and I was, riding shotgun, passenger seat, I would try to read books. That was hard because it's so bumpy on the road. But I would listen to books, listen to YouTube videos, and because I really like Vikings, the show, but not just the show, the mythology and everything about the Vikings, I found this book called The Smokey God, and it is a fairly short book, but I haven't seemed to been able to read it all. I only got to the first chapter or so, and now that I have time and I'm reading videos on this channel, I decided, why not read it on the channel and see how far I can get. So it's called The Smokey God, and I'm going to tell you, I'm going to skip the author's, it's called the author's forward, because how I feel is it's a boring read. Like it's interesting, but for me to read it, it might get a little boring. And it gets much interesting after that. So I'm going to give you really, I can't speak, synopsis of the author's foreword and give you an idea of what this book is about. I'm also part Scandinavian and Norwegian and all that. So I have an interest in the culture or the Vikings because of that. So please let me know how this sounds to you. Do you like this mic? If so, how can I improve it? Is it too loud, too quiet? I would prefer it to be louder than quieter, because if you're listening to videos consecutively, it's like if one's too quiet, you gotta turn up the volume, and then, the next video comes on and it might be it'll be louder, too loud. So I don't know. I'd prefer it to be just the right volume. So if you can help me with that, I know I got a few subscribers, new ones, that have been interactive with me, and I would really appreciate your feedback. So let's get into what the Smokey God is about, and I will give you that synopsis of the first part. So, the Smokey God, or A Voyage to the Inner World. It is written by Willis George Emerson. On the back, to give you an idea, I'll explain. The story is practically the diary of Olaf Jensen and tells of his strange theory of another world within the crust of our visible globe of everyday knowledge. However, how he found this mysterious world and what occurred while there makes a tale of rare interest. To tell too much of the plot would break the spell for those who have not read the book. Suffice to say that it equals Mr. Emerson's other works. The book will undoubtedly grow in interest year by year because it has more than the merit of a well-told tale. Its scientific value will attract the philosopher and the student, as well as the ordinary novel reader. And that's from the National Magazine. Okay, and then another part on the back here says, the Smokey God tells the purportedly true tale of a Norwegian sailor, Olaf Jensen's discovery of an entryway into the hollow earth. I'll explain that more in a minute. After discovering the entrance at the North Pole, Jensen remained with the dwellers of the underground world for 2 years. First published in 1908, The Smokey God is an early classic civilization in the Hollow Earth genre. Here's another thing on the back. I should have read this first, but I'm trying to make sure that we read the interesting parts, because this is a good read in my opinion, and it's short. See, Smokey God. I'll put pictures in the beginning of this video when I edit it. The possibility of a land inside the earth were first brought to my attention when I picked up a geode on the shores of the Great Lakes. The geode is a spherical and apparently solid stone, but when broken is found to be hollow and coated with crystals. The earth is only a larger form of a geode, and the law that created the geode in its hollow form undoubtedly fashioned the earth in the same way. And that is said by, that is a quote by Dr. Orville Livingston Leach. So, to give you a synopsis of, there goes my furnace, I apologize. hopefully it sounds more relaxing than it does annoying. So basically, the author becomes friends with an old man named Olaf Jensen. They become decent friends out in California, and Olaf Jensen was originally from Norway, and what happened was, according to him, he and his father was a fisherman and had a big fishing boat. His father one day asked his son, Olaf, who tells the story, if he wants to go further north and further north, because they had gotten some really good stuff the year before, and that's how they make their money. So Olaf was just a little boy, and he said yes. He said yes to his father. Try not to make too much noise there. And his father and him decided to go north. Now, Norway is already pretty far north, so obviously by doing so, they were planning on going towards, like, close to the North Pole, I guess. That's what they did. And what happened was, as they got further north, they ended up finding that it wasn't cold anymore. They went through a heck of a bunch of storms and got shifted around, and they were running out of food and the water. They're in the sea, so running out of water. And one day, when they were far north, things started to change. It wasn't as cold, and this has been reported. This is something it says in the beginning too. Like, different studies have shown, or it's been said that it actually isn't as cold like when you get up north. And there's a theory behind that whole inner earth thing that they're talking about here. I'll get into that in a second. But basically, Olaf had some water splash on him, and it splashed into his mouth, and his father was sleeping. He woke his father up, and he said, Father, the water here is not it's not salty, because they were running out of water. It's fresh. So his father tasted the water, and it was indeed fresh. So basically, things started happening, but when he came back, what he tells Willis Emerson, who is the writer of this book, I guess it's kind of a speculation of whether this is a true story or if it's Olaf Jensen's way of telling someone else so that things wouldn't happen to him, and I'll explain why. And this is all explained in the author's foreword. He talks about Olaf and everything. So basically, when Olaf came back from this journey, the details of the journey I'll get into when I read the book, a bunch of crazy things had happened. He had told the story to his uncle, who he thought he could trust, and his uncle acted like he found out his mother died, by the way. He was gone for 2 years, apparently, and his uncle, he thought he could trust him, and his uncle made him sign some papers, like, just sign here saying that's your story. Well, it just so happened that his uncle had him sign papers, and he was still a boy, and he got put in a crazy home. Crazy hospital for about, it'll say in the book, I think 40 something years. So he lived most of his life in there. And when he finally got out, when he was in there, he never talked of it again. And when he got out, he never talked of it again. He had a lot of records of things and did a lot of research. He ended up starting his own fishing business again, was able to move to the Americas, and then ended up in California, met the author, became friends with him, and then on his dying bed, he had him come over, and he told him, I have something I need to show you and tell you. It's going to sound crazy. If I were to have said it before I died, I may go back to the crazy house, or something could happen to me, because this is knowledge that is hidden. So, if you write it, basically, you can say it's a story, and people will, question things, but you won't face what I faced, basically. So, that's what this book is. It is about the tale of Olaf Jensen, written by Willis Emerson, and I'm going to get into reading the book now. I'm going to try to read as much as I can, and I'm going to try not to make too many loud noises. And if I am making too many loud noises, or if I'm not being loud enough, please let me know, okay? I am definitely working on producing the best quality videos as I can, because this picks up so much sound. I just gotta be super careful. Okay, so this is part 2, Olaf Jensen's story. It might say a lot of what I said in the beginning, so. My name is Olaf Jensen. I'm a Norwegian, although I was born in the little seafaring Russian town in Julberg on the eastern coast of the Gulf of Bothnia, the northern arm of the Baltic Sea. My parents were on a fishing cruise in the Gulf of Bothnia and put into the Russian town of Julberg at the time of my birth, being the 27th day of October 1811. My father, Jens Jansen, was born at Rodwig on the Scandinavian coast near the Lofton Islands, but after marrying, made his home at Stockholm because my mother's people resided in that city. When 7 years old, I began going with my father on his fishing trips along the Scandinavian coast. Early in life, I displayed an aptitude for books, and at the age of 9 years was placed in private school in Stockholm, remaining there until I was 14. After that, I made regular trips with my father on all his fishing voyages. My father was a man fully 6'3" in height and weighed over 15 stone, a typical Norseman of the most rugged sort, and capable of more endurance than any other man I have ever known. He possessed the gentleness of a woman in tender little ways, yet his determination and willpower were beyond description. His will admitted of no defeat. I was in my 19th year when we started on what proved to be our last trip as fishermen, and which resulted in the strange story that shall be given to the world, but not until I have finished my earthly pilgrimage. I dare not allow the facts as I know them to be published while I am living, for fear of further humiliation, confinement, and suffering. First of all, I was put in irons by the captain of the whaling vessel that rescued me. For no other reason than that I told the truth about the marvelous discoveries made by my father and myself. But this was far from being the end of my tortures. After 4 years and 8 months' absence, I reached Stockholm, only to find my mother had died the previous year, and the property left by my parents in the possession of my mother's people. But it was at once made over to me. All might have been well had I erased from my memory the story of our adventure and of my father's terrible death. Finally, one day, I told the story in detail to my uncle, Gustav Osterland, a man of considerable property, and urged him to fit out on an expedition for me to make another voyage to the strange land. At first, I thought he favored my project. He seemed interested and invited me to go before certain officials and explain to them, as I had to him, the story of our travels and discoveries. Imagine my disappointment and horror when, upon the conclusion of my narrative, certain papers were signed by my uncle, and without warning I found myself arrested and hurried away to small and fear confinement in a madhouse, where I remained for 28 years. Okay, so I was way off. It wasn't 40, it was 28. 28 years, long, tedious, frightful years of suffering. I never ceased to assert my sanity and to protest against the injustice of my confinement. Finally, on the 17th of October, 1862, I was released. My uncle was dead, and the friends of my youth were now strangers. Indeed, a man over 50 years old, whose only known record is that of a madman, has no friends. That would suck. I was at a loss to know what to do for a living, but instinctively turned toward the harbor, where fishing boats in great numbers were anchored, and within a week I had shipped with a fisherman by the name of Jan Hansen, who was starting on a long fishing cruise to the Lofton Islands. I don't know if I'm saying that right, I'm sorry. Apparently I pronounce a lot of things wrong. Here my earlier years of training proved of the very greatest advantage, especially in enabling me to make myself useful. This was but the beginning of other trips, and by frugal economy I was, in a few years, able to own a fishing brig of my own. For 27 years thereafter, I followed the sea as a fisherman, 5 years working for others, and the last 22 for myself. During all these years, I was a most diligent student of books, as well as a hard worker at my business. But I took great care not to mention to anyone the story concerning the discoveries made by my father and myself. Even at this late day, I would be fearful of having anyone see or know the things I am writing, and the records and maps I have in my keeping. When my days on earth are finished, I shall leave maps and records that will enlighten and, I hope, benefit mankind. The memory of my long confinement with maniacs and all the horrible anguish and sufferings are too vivid to warrant my taking further chances. In 1889, I was sold out of my fishing boats, and I found I had accumulated a fortune quite sufficient to keep me the remainder of my life. I then came to America. For a dozen years, my home was in Illinois, near Batavia, where I gathered most of my books in my present library. Though I brought many choice volumes from Stockholm, later I came to Los Angeles, arriving here March 4th, 1901. The date I will remember as it was President McKinley's second inauguration day. I brought this humble home and determined here, in the privacy of my own abode, sheltered by my own vine and fig tree, and with my books about me, to make maps and drawings of the new lands we had discovered, and also to write the story in detail from the time my father and I left Stockholm until the tragic event that parted us in the Antarctic Ocean. I'm gonna drink some water really quick and not make too much noise, hopefully. Take a sip of water here. Please give me feedback about this sound of the microphone. Just so thirsty. Okay. Making sure my computer is charging. Yes. Okay. So. That was the bottle. Sorry. Okay. I bought this humble home and determined here in the privacy of my own abode, sheltered by my own vine and fig tree, and with my books about me, to make maps and drawings of the new lands we had discovered, and also to write the story in detail from the time my father and I left Stockholm until the tragic event that parted us in the Antarctic Ocean. I well remember that we left Stockholm in our fishing sloop on the 3rd day of April, 1829, and sailed to the southward, leaving the Gothland Island to the left of the Olin Island to the right. A few days later, we succeeded in doubling Sandholmar Point and made our way through the sound which separates Denmark from the Scandinavian coast. In due time, we put in at the town of Kristiansand, where we rested 2 days and then started around the Scandinavian coast to the westward, bound for the Lofton Islands. My father was in high spirit because of the excellent and gratifying returns he had received from our last catch by marketing at Stockholm. Instead of selling at one of the seafaring towns along the Scandinavian coast, he was especially pleased with the sale of some ivory tusks that he had found on the west coast of Franz Josef Land during one of his northern cruises the previous year, and he expressed the hope that this time we might be again as fortunate enough to load our little fishing sloop with ivory instead of cod, herring, mackerel, and salmon. We put in at Hammerfest, latitude 71 degrees and 40 minutes. For a few days' rest, here we remained 1 week, laying in an extra supply of provisions and several casks of drinking water, and then sailed towards Spitsbergen. For the first few days, we had an open sea and a faring wind, and then we encountered much ice and many icebergs. A vessel larger than our little fishing sloop could not possibly have threaded its way among the labyrinth of icebergs or squeezed through the barely open channels. These monster bergs presented an endless succession of crystal palaces, of massive cathedrals and fantastic mountain ranges, grim and sentinel-like, immovable as some towering cliff of solid rock, standing silent as a sphinx, resisting the restless waves of a fretful sea. After many narrow escapes, we arrived at Spitsbergen on 23rd of June and anchored at Wajad Bay for a short time, where we were quite successful in our catches. We then lifted anchor and sailed through the Hinlopen Strait, and coasted along the northeast land. A strong wind came up from the southwest, and my father said that we had better take advantage of it and try to reach Franz Joseph Land, where the year before he had by accident found the ivory tusks that had brought him such a good price at Stockholm. Never before or since have I seen so many seafowl. They were so numerous that they hid the rocks on the coastline and darkened the sky. For several days we sailed along the rocky coast of Franz Joseph Land. Finally, a favoring wind came up that enabled us to make the west coast. And after sailing 24 hours, we came to a beautiful inlet. One could hardly believe it was the far Northland. The place was green with growing vegetation, and while the area did not comprise more than 1 or 2 acres, yet the air was warm and tranquil. It seemed to be at the point where the Gulf Stream's influence is most keenly felt. Okay, I am going to read this little side note here. It says, Sir John Barrow Wart, FRS, in his work entitled Voyages of Discovery and Research within the Arctic Regions, says on page 57, Mr. Beechey refers to what has frequently been found and noticed, the mildness of temperature on the western coast of Spitsbergen, there being little or no sensation of cold. This is what I was talking about. Though the thermometer might be only a few degrees above the freezing point, the brilliant and lively effect of a clear day, when the sun shines forth with a pure sky, whose azure hue is so intense as to find no parallel even in the boasted Italian sky. On the east coast, there were numerous icebergs, yet here we were in open water. Far to the west of us, however, were ice packs, and still farther to the westward, the ice appeared like ranges of low hills. In front of us and directly to the north lay an open sea. Okay, so I'm going to read the side notes again. Captain Kane, on page 299, quoting from Morton's journal on Monday, the 26th of December, says, as far as I could see, the open passages were 15 miles or more wide, with sometimes mashed ice separating them, but is all small ice, and I think it either drives out to the open space to the north or rots and sinks, as I could see none ahead to the north. So basically he's putting in information here, proven about what he's saying, that the temperature isn't as cold, that there's less icebergs. It's kind of weird, you think of the north and you think it would be cold. So my father was an ardent believer in Odin and Thor. If you don't know who that is, I can read some Norse mythology. Odin was the Allfather, kind of like, I hate to compare, but kind of like Zeus, Christianity, God, and Jesus. Thor was his son. So my father was an ardent believer in Odin and Thor, and had frequently told me they were gods who came from far beyond the north wind. There was a tradition, my father explained, that still farther northward was a land more beautiful than any that mortal man had ever known, and that it was inhabited by the chosen. We find the following in the Dutch mythology, page 778, from the pen of Jacob Grimm. It says, "Then the sons of Bor built in the middle of the universe the city called Asgard." I think I'm saying that Asgard. I watched Vikings, I should know this. And I've read the mythology. Where dwell the gods and their kindred, and from that abode work out so many wondrous things both on the earth and in the heavens above it. There is in that city a place called Ilidskjalf, Ilidskjalf. And when Odin is seated there upon his lofty throne, he sees over the whole world and discerns all the actions of men. What was I going to say? So that's basically the Vikings believed in Odin, Thor, Loki, and Freya. I find their mythology very interesting. If you haven't checked out my giant skeletons found around the world or North America, you should check it out. One of the things I find funny about mythology is that a lot of mythologies, or pretty much all of them, mention giants. Even the Norse mythology, they called them the ice giants, or they were called the ice giants. There might have been another word, but the ice giants. So they were, and they were here. In the mythology, they were here first. They came from the Kaminga Gap, which was, there was an icy fog and a fiery pit, and in between the two, basically the ice giants came first, and then came Thor's father before that. So the gods came second, and they destroyed, or did a lot of damage to the ice giants. But anyways, just a little interesting tidbit about their mythology, that there were giants in it. So my youthful imagination was fired by the ardor, zeal, and religious fervor of my good father, and I exclaimed, "Why not sail to this goodly land? The sky is fair, the wind favorable, and the sea open." Even now I can see the expression of pleasurable surprise on his countenance as he turned toward me and asked, "My son, are you willing to go with me and explore? To go far beyond where man has ventured?" I answered affirmatively. "Very well." He replied, "May the god Odin protect us." And quickly adjusting the sails, he glanced at our compass and turned the prow in due northerly direction through an open channel, and our voyage had begun. The sun was low in the horizon, as it was still the early summer indeed. We had almost 4 months of day ahead of us before the frozen night could come again. Our little fishing sloop sprang forward as if eager as ourselves for adventure. Within 36 hours we were out of sight of the highest point on the coastline of Franz Joseph Land. We seemed to be in a strong current running north by northeast, and far to the right and to the left of us were icebergs. But our little sloop bore down on the narrows and passed through the channels and out into the open seas. Channels so narrow in places that, had our craft been other than small, we never would have gotten through. On the third day we came to an island. Its shores were washed by an open sea. My father determined to land and explore for a day. This new land was destitute of timber, but we found a large accumulation of driftwood on the northern shore. Some of the trunks of the trees were 40 feet long and 2 feet in diameter. And then it goes into quote from other books and other sightings that this is true about the trees. After one day's exploration of the coastline of this island, we lifted anchor and turned our prow to the north in an open sea. I remember that neither my father nor myself had tasted food for almost 30 hours. Perhaps this was because of the tension of excitement about our strange voyage in waters further north. My father said than anyone had ever been before. Active mentality had dulled the demands of the physical needs. Instead of the cold being intense as we had anticipated, it was really warmer and more pleasant than it had been in a while in Hammerfest on the north coast of Norway, some 6 weeks before. We both frankly admitted that we were very hungry, and forthwith I prepared a substantial meal from our well-stored larder. When we had partaken heartily of the repast, I told my father I believed I would sleep, as I was beginning to feel quite drowsy. Very well, he replied, I will keep the watch. I have no way to determine how long I slept. I only know that I was rudely awakened by a terrible commotion of the sloop. To my surprise, I found my father sleeping soundly. I cried out lustily to him, and starting up, he sprang quickly to his feet. Indeed, had he not instantly clutched the rail, he would certainly have been thrown into the seething waves. A fierce snowstorm was raging. The wind was directly astern, driving our sloop at a terrific speed, and was threatening every moment to capsize us. There was no time to lose. The sails had to be lowered immediately. Our boat was writhing in convulsions. A few icebergs we knew were on either side of us, but fortunately the channel was open directly to the north. But would it remain so? In front of us, skirting the horizon from the left to the right, was a vaporish fog or mist, black as Egyptian night at the water's edge, and white like a steam cloud toward the top, which was finally lost to view as it blended with the great white flakes of falling snow. Whether it covered a treacherous iceberg or some other hidden obstacle against which our little sloop would dash and send us into a water grave, or was merely the phenomenon of an Arctic fog, there was no way to determine. By what miracle we escaped being dashed to utter destruction, I do not know. I remember our little craft creaked and groaned as if its joints were breaking. It rocked and staggered to and fro as if it clutched by some fierce undertow of whirlpool or maelstrom. Fortunately, our compass had been fastened with long screws to a crossbeam. Most of our provisions, however, were tumbled out and swept away from the deck of the cuddy. And had we not taken the precaution at the beginning to tie ourselves firmly to the masts of the sloop, we should have been swept into the lashing sea. Above the deafening tumult of the raging waves, I heard my father's voice. "Be courageous, my son," he shouted. "Odin is the god of the waters, the companion of the brave, and he is with us. Fear not." To me it seemed there was no possibility of our escaping a horrible death. The little sloop was slipping water. The snow was falling so fast as to be blinding, and the waves were tumbling over our counters in reckless white-sprayed fury. There was no telling what instant we should be dashed against some drifting ice pack. The tremendous swells would heave us up to the very peaks of mountainous waves, then plunged us down into the depths of the seas through trough, as if our fishing sloop were a fragile shell. Gigantic white-capped waves, like veritable walls, fenced us in, fore and aft. This terrible, nerve-wracking ordeal, with its nameless horrors of suspense and agony, of fear indescribable, continued for more than 3 hours. And all the time we were being driven forward at fierce speed. Then suddenly, as if growing weary of its frantic exertions, the wind began to lessen its fury, and by degrees to die down. At last we were in a perfect calm. The fog mist had also disappeared, and before us lay an iceless channel, perhaps 10 or 15 miles wide, with a few icebergs far away to our right, and an intermittent archipelago of smaller ones to the left. I watched my father closely, determined to remain silent until he spoke. Presently he untied the rope from his waist, and without saying a word, began working on the pumps, which fortunately were not damaged, relieving the sloop of the water it had shipped in the madness of the storm. He put up the sloop's sails as calmly as if casting a fishing net, and then remarked that we were ready for a favoring wind when it came. His courage and persistence were truly remarkable. On investigation, we found less than 1/3 of our provisions remaining, while to our utter dismay, we discovered that our water casks had been swept overboard during violent plungings of our boat. Two of our water casks were in the main hold, but both were empty. We had a fair supply of food, but no fresh water. I realized at once the awfulness of our position. Presently I was seized with a consuming thirst. "It is indeed bad," remarked my father. "However, let us dry our bedraggled clothing, for we are soaked to the skin. Trust to the god Odin, my son. Do not give up hope." The sun was beating down slantingly, as if it were in a southern latitude, instead of in the far northland. It was swinging around its orbit, ever visible, and rising higher and higher each day. Frequently mist-covered, yet always peering through the lacework of clouds, like some fretful eye of fate, guarding the mysterious northland and jealously watching the pranks of man. Far to our right, the rays decking the prisms of icebergs were gorgeous. Their reflections emitted flashes of garnet, of diamond, of sapphire, a pyrotechnic panorama of countless colors and shapes, while below could be seen the green-tinted sea and above the purple sky. So this is called part 3, Beyond the North Wind. I'm gonna pause for just a second here. Okay guys, I'm back. Probably didn't have to announce it, but I did. Sorry. I needed some eye drops for my eyes. They're getting a little dry. Okay. So part 3, Beyond the North Wind. I tried to forget my thirst by busying myself with bringing up some food from an empty vessel from the hold, reaching over the side rail. I filled the vessel with water for the purpose of laving my hands and face. To my astonishment, when the water came in contact with my lips, I could taste no salt. I was startled by the discovery. "Father," I fairly gasped. The water, it's fresh." "What, Olaf?" exclaimed my father, glancing hastily around. "Surely you are mistaken. There's no land. You are going mad." "But taste it," I cried. And thus we made the discovery that the water was indeed fresh, absolutely so, without the least briny taste or even the suspicion of a salty flavor. We forthwith filled our remaining water casks, and my father declared it was a heavenly dispensation of mercy from the gods of Odin and Thor. We were almost beside ourselves with joy, but hunger bade us end our enforced fast. Now that we had found fresh water in the open sea, what might we not expect in this strange latitude where ship had never been sailed before, and the splash of an oar had never been heard. I talk about I give, instances of they give examples again of confirming from other people what I just said. So we had scarcely appeased our hunger when a breeze began filling the idle sails, and glancing at the compass we found that the northern point pressing hard against the glass. In response to my surprise, my father said, "I have heard of this before. It is what they call the dipping of the needle." We loosened the compass and turned it at right angles with the surface of the sea before its point would free itself from the glass and point according to unmolested attraction. It shifted uneasily and seemed as unsteady as a drunken man, but finally pointed a course. Before this, we thought the wind was carrying us north by northwest, but with the needle free, we discovered, if it could be relied upon, that we were sailing slightly north by northeast. Our course, however, was ever tending northward. And then there's something supporting what they just said about the needle going crazy. We again find the sea was serenely smooth, with hardly a choppy wave, and the wind brisk and exhilarating. The sun's rays, while striking us aslant, furnished tranquil warmth, and thus time wore on, day after day, and we found from the record in our logbook we had been sailing 11 days since the storm in the open sea. By strictest economy, our food was holding out fairly well, but beginning to run low. In the meantime, one of our casks of water had been exhausted, and my father said, "We will fill it again." But to our dismay, we found the water was now as salt as in the region of the Lofton Islands, off the coast of Norway. This necessitated our being extremely careful of the remaining cask. I found myself wanting to sleep much of the time, whether it was the effect of the exciting experience of sailing in unknown waters or the relaxation from the awful excitement incident to our adventure in a storm at sea, or due to want of food, I could not say. I frequently lay down on the bunker of our little sloop and looked far up into the blue dome of the sky, and notwithstanding the sun was shining far away in the east, I always saw a single star overhead. For several days when I looked for this star, it was always there directly above us. It was now, according to our reckoning, about the 1st of August. The sun was high in the heavens and was so bright that I could no longer see the one lone star that attracted my attention a few days earlier. One day about this time, my father startled me by calling my attention to a novel sight far in front of us, almost at the horizon. "It is a mock sun," exclaimed my father. "I have read of them. It is called a reflection or mirage. It will soon pass away." But this dull, red, false sun, as we supposed it to be, did not pass away for several hours, and while we were unconscious of its emitting any rays of light, still there was no time thereafter when we could not sweep away the horizon in front and locate the illumination of the so-called false sun during a period of at least 12 hours out of every 24. Clouds and mists would at times almost, but never entirely, hide its location. Gradually it seemed to climb higher in the horizon of the uncertain purple sky as we advanced. It could hardly be said to resemble the sun except in its circular shape, and when not obscured by clouds or the ocean mists, it had a hazy red, bronzed appearance, which would change to a white light like a luminous cloud, as if reflecting some greater light beyond. We finally agreed in our discussion of this smoky furnace-colored sun that whatever the cause of the phenomenon, it was not a reflection of our sun, but a planet of some sort, a reality. One day soon after this, I felt excitingly drowsy and fell into a sound sleep, but it seemed that I was almost immediately roused by my father's vigorous shaking of me and by the shoulder and saying, "Olaf, awaken, there is land in sight." I sprang to my feet, and oh, joy unspeakable! There, far in the distance, yet directly in our path, were lands jutting boldly into the sea. Shoreline stretched far away to the right of us, as far as the eye could see, and all along the sandy beach were waves breaking into choppy foam, receding, then going forward again, ever chanting in monotonous thunder tones the song of the deep. The banks were covered with trees and vegetation. I cannot express my feeling of exultation at this discovery. My father stood motionless with his hand on the tiller, looking straight ahead, pouring out his heart in thankful prayer and thanksgiving to the gods Odin and Thor. In the meantime, a net which we found in the stowage had been cast, and we caught a few fish that materially added to our dwindling stock of provisions. The compass which we had fastened back in its place, in fear of another storm, was still pointing due north and moving on its pivot, just as it had at Stockholm. The dipping of the needle had ceased. What could this mean? Then, to our many days of sailing had certainly carried us far past the North Pole, and yet the needle continued to point north. We were sorely perplexed, for surely our direction was now south. We sailed for 3 days along the shoreline, then came to the mouth of a forged or a river of immense size. It seemed more like a great bay, and into this we turned our fishing craft, the direction being slightly northeast of south, by the assistance of a fretful wind that came to our aid about 12 hours of every 24. We continued to make our way inland into what afterward proved to be a mighty river, and which we learned was called by the inhabitants Hiddekel, Hiddekel. We continued our journey for 10 days thereafter, and found we had fortunately attained a distant inland where ocean tides no longer affected the water, which had become fresh. The discovery came none too soon, for our remaining cask of water was well nigh exhausted. We lost no time in replenishing our casks, and continued to sail further up the river when the wind was favorable. Along the banks, great forests, miles in extent, could be seen stretching away on the shoreline. The trees were of enormous size. We landed after anchoring near a sandy beach, and waded ashore, and were rewarded by finding a quantity of nuts that were very palatable and satisfying to hunger, and a welcome change from the monotony of our stock of provisions. It was about the 1st of September, over 5 months, we calculated, since our leave taking from Stockholm. Suddenly we were frightened almost out of our wits by hearing in the far distance of the singing of people. Very soon thereafter we discovered a huge ship gliding down the river directly towards us. Those aboard were singing in one mighty chorus that, echoing from bank to bank, sounded like 1,000 voices filling the whole universe with quivering melody. The accompaniment was played on stringing instruments, not unlike our harps. It was a larger ship than any we had ever seen, and was differently constructed. Okay, so I am going to read this. Asiatic mythology, Asiatic. On page 240, Paradise Found, from translation by Sayce in a book called Records of the Past. We were told of a dwelling which the gods created for the first human beings, a dwelling in which they became great and increased in numbers, and the location of which is described in words exactly corresponding to those of Iranian, Indian, Chinese, Ediac, and Aztec literature, namely in the center of the earth. In the center of the earth. At this particular time, our sloop was becalmed and not far from the shore. The bank of the river, covered with mammoth trees, rose up several 100 feet in beautiful fashion. We seemed to be on the edge of some primeval forest that doubtless stretched far inland. The immense craft paused, and almost immediately a boat was lowered, and 6 men of gigantic stature. Interesting. Remember, his dad is 6'3", so rowed to our little fishing sloop. They spoke to us in a strange language. We knew from their manner, however, that they were not unfriendly. They talked a great deal among themselves, and one of them laughed immoderately, as though in finding us a queer discovery had been made. One of them spied our compass and seemed to interest them more than any other part of our sloop. I'm going to move a little closer here. Maybe this will be more comfortable. Finally, the leader motioned as if to ask whether we were willing to leave our craft to go on board their ship. "What you say, my son?" asked my father. "They cannot do any more than kill us." "They seem to be kindly disposed," I replied, "although what terrible giants! They must be the select six of the kingdom's crack regimen. Just look at their great size. We may as well go willingly as be taken by force, said my father, smiling, for they are certainly able to capture us. Thereupon he made known by signs that we were ready to accompany them. Within a few minutes we were on board the ship, and half an hour later our little fishing craft had been lifted bodily out of the water by a strange sort of hook and tackle, and set on board as a curiosity. There were several hundred people on board this, to us, mammoth ship, which we discovered was called the Norse, meaning, as afterward learned, pleasure, or, to give a more proper interpretation, pleasure excursion ship. If my father and I were curiously observed by the ship's occupants, this strange race of giants offered us an equal amount of wonderment. There was not a single man aboard who would not have measured fully 12 feet in height. You should definitely check out my my skeletons, giant skeletons videos, where I read about that. Interesting. They all wore full beards, not particularly long, but seemingly short-cropped. They had mild and beautiful faces, exceedingly fair, with ruddy complexions. The hair and beard of some were black, others sandy, and still others yellow. The captain, as we designated the dignitary in command of the great vessel, was fully a head taller than any of his companions. The women averaged from 10 to 11 feet in height. Their features were especially regular and refined, while their complexion was of a most delicate tint, heightened by a healthful glow. According to all procurable data, the spot at the era of the man's appearance upon the stage was the now lost Miocene continent, which then surrounded the Arctic pole. That in true original Eden, some of the early generations of men attained to a stature and longevity unequaled in any countries known to post-diluvian history, is by no means scientifically incredible. Oh, that's from a book called Paradise Found. I get confused sometimes, they throw on that. Okay, so both men and women seem to possess that particular ease of manner which we deem a sign of good breeding, and notwithstanding their huge statures, there was nothing about them suggesting awkwardness. As I was a lad in only my 19th year, I was doubtless looked upon as a true Tom Thumb. My father's 6'3" did not lift the top of his head above the waistline of these people. Each one seemed to vie with the others in extending courtesies and showing kindness to us, but all laughed heartily. I remember when they had to improvise chairs for my father and myself to sit at a table. They were richly attired in a costume peculiar to themselves and very attractive. The men were clothed in handsomely embroidered tunics of silk and satin and belted at the waist. They wore knee breeches and stockings of a fine texture. While their feet were encased in sandals adorned with gold buckles, we early discovered that gold was one of the most common metals known, and that it was used extensively in decoration. Strange as it may seem, neither my father nor myself felt the least bit of solicitude for our safety. "We have come into our own," my father said to me. "This is the fulfillment of the tradition told by my father and my father's father, and still back for many generations of our race. This assuredly the land beyond the north wind." We seemed to make such an impression on the party that we were given specially into the charge of one of the men, Jules Galdea, and his wife, for the purpose of being educated in their language, and we on our part were just as eager to learn as they were to instruct. At the captain's command, the vessel was swung cleverly about and began retracing its course up the river. The machinery, while noiseless, was very powerful. The banks and trees on either side seemed to rush by. The ship's speed at times surpassed that of any railroad train on which I have ever ridden. Even here in America, it was wonderful. In the meantime, we had lost sight of the sun's rays, but we found a radiance within emanating from the dull, red sun which had already attracted our attention. Now giving out a white light seemingly from a cloud bank far away in front of us, it dispensed a greater light, I should say, than 2 full moons on the clearest night. In 12 hours this cloud of whiteness would pass out of sight as if eclipsed, and then the 12 hours following corresponded with our night. We early learned that these strange people were worshippers of this great cloud of night. It was the Smokey God of the inner world. The ship was equipped with a mode of illumination which I now presume was electricity. But neither my father nor myself were sufficiently skilled in mechanics to understand whence came the power to operate the ship, or to maintain the soft, beautiful lights that answered the same purpose of our present methods of lighting the streets of our cities and houses and places of business. It must be remembered the time of which I write was the autumn of 1829, and we of the outside surface of the earth knew nothing then, so to speak, of electricity. The electrically surcharged condition of the air was a constant vitalizer. I never felt better in my life than during the 2 years my father and I sojourned on the inside of the earth. To resume my narrative of events, the ship on which we were sailing came to a stop 2 days after we had been taken on board. My father said, as nearly as he could judge, we were directly under Stockholm or London. The city we had reached was called Jehu, signifying a seaport town. The houses were large and beautifully constructed, and quite uniform in appearance, yet without sameness. The principal occupation of the people appeared to be agriculture. The hillsides were covered with vineyards, while the valleys were devoted to the growing of grain. Mind you, this is all supposed to be on the inside of the earth. And they're saying that they got to the top of the earth, somehow sailed into the inside of it. If you think about it, it's not so crazy because of the Bermuda Triangle, people disappearing, Dragon's Triangle. We don't really know that much about the North Pole or the South Pole, and as far as I've read in certain things, I don't even think people are allowed to really visit. So anyways, keep those things in mind. And if the earth was hollow, if it is, we do have a lot of caves, things like that. I think this is different, but maybe they'll explain it a little better. I never saw such a display of gold. It was everywhere. The door casings were inlaid, and the tables were veneered with sheetings of gold. Domes of the public buildings were of gold. It was used most generously in the finishings of the great temples of music. Vegetation grew in lavish exuberance, and fruit of all kinds possessed the most delicate flavors. Clusters of grapes 4 and 5 feet in length, each grape as large as an orange, and apples larger than a man's head, typified the wonderful growth of all things on the inside of the earth. The great redwood trees of California would be considered mere underbrush compared with the giant forest trees extending for miles and miles in all directions and many directions along the foothills of the mountains. Vast herds of cattle were seen during the last day of our travel on the river. We heard much of a city called Eden, but were kept at Jehu for an entire year. By the end of that time, we had learned to speak fairly well the language of this strange race of people. Our instructors, Jules Galdea and his wife, exhibited a patience that was truly commendable. One day, an envoy from the ruler at Eden came to see us, and for 2 whole days my father and myself were put through a series of surprising questions. They wished to know from whence we came, what sort of people dwelt without, what God we worshipped, our religious beliefs, the mode of living in our strange land, and 1,000 other things. The compass which we brought with us attracted especial attention. My father and I commented between ourselves on the fact that the compass still pointed north, although we now knew that we had sailed over the curve or edge of the earth's aperture and were far along southward on the inside surface of the earth's crust, which according to my father's estimate and my own, is about 300 miles in thickness from the inside to the outside surface. Relatively speaking, it is no thicker than an eggshell, so that there is an almost as much surface on the inside as on the outside of the earth. The great luminous cloud or ball of dull red fire, fiery red in the mornings and evenings, and during the day giving off a beautiful white light, the Smokey God, is seemingly suspended in the center of the great vacuum within the earth and held to its place by the immutable law of gravitation or a repellent atmospheric force, as the case may be. I refer to the known power that draws or repels with equal force in all directions. The base of this electrical cloud or central luminary, the seat of the gods, is dark and non-transparent, save for innumerable small openings, seemingly in the bottom of the great support or altar of the deity upon which the Smokey God rests, and the lights shining through these many openings twinkle at night in all their splendor, and seem to be stars, as natural as the stars we saw shining when in our home at Stockholm, excepting that they appear larger. The Smokey God, therefore, with each daily revolution of the earth, appears to come in the east and go down in the west, the same as does our sun on the external surface in reality. The people within believe that the Smokey God is the throne of their Jehovah, and is stationary. The effect of night and day is therefore produced by the earth's daily rotation. I have since discovered that the language of the people of the inner world is as much like Sanskrit. After we had given an account of ourselves to the emissaries from the central seat of government of the inner continent, and my father had, in his crude way, drawn maps at their request of the outside surface of the earth, showing the divisions of land and water, and giving the name of each of the continents, large islands, and the oceans, we were taken overland to the city of Eden in a conveyance different from anything we have in Europe or America. This vehicle was doubtless some electrical contrivance. It was noiseless and ran on a single iron rail in perfect balance. The trip was made at a very high rate of speed. We were carried up hills and down dales, across valleys, and again along the sides of steep mountains, without any apparent attempt having been made to level the earth as we do for railroad tracks. The car seats were huge yet comfortable affairs, and very high above the floor of the car. On the top of each car were high-geared flywheels, lying on their sides, which were so automatically adjusted that as the speed of the car increased, the high speed of these flywheels geometrically increased. Jules Gildea explained to us that these revolving fan-like wheels on top of the cars destroyed atmospheric pressure, or what is generally understood by the term gravitation, and with this force thus destroyed or rendered nugatory, the car is as safe from falling to one side or the other from the single rail track as if it were in a vacuum. The flywheels in their rapid revolutions destroying effectually the so-called power of gravitation, or the force of atmospheric pressure, or whatever potent influence it may be that causes all unsupported things to fall downward to the earth's surface, or to the nearest point of resistance. The surprise of my father and myself was indescribable, when amid the regal magnificence of a spacious hall, we were finally brought before the great high priest, ruler over all the land. He was richly robed and much taller than those around him, and could not have been less than 14 or 15 feet in height. The immense room in which we were received seemed finished in solid slabs of gold, thickly studded with jewels of amazing brilliancy. The city of Eden is located in what seems to be a beautiful valley, yet, in fact, it is on the loftiest mountain plateau of Inner Connecticut, continent, several thousand feet higher than any portion of the surrounding country. It is the most beautiful place I've ever beheld in all my travels. In this elevated garden, all manner of fruits, vines, shrubs, trees, and flowers grow in righteous profusion. In this garden, 4 rivers have their source in a mighty artesian fountain. They divide and flow in 4 directions. This place is called by the inhabitants the navel of the earth, or the beginning, the cradle of the human race. The names of the rivers are the Euphrates, the Pison, the Gihon, and the Hiddekel. Oh, this is referring to the Bible. I apologize. It gets confusing. So this is just another quote from the Bible, I believe. And the Lord God planted a garden, and out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The book of Genesis. That got a little confusing, but I guess what they're referring to is like what Eden was, and comparing it to what this Eden is. The unexpected awaited us. The unexpected awaited us in this palace of beauty. In the findings of our little fishing craft, it had been brought before the high priest in perfect shape, just as it had been taken from the waters that day when it was loaded on board the ship by the people who discovered us on the river more than a year before. We were given an audience of over 2 hours with this great dignitary, who seemed kindly disposed and considerate. He showed himself eagerly interested, asking us numerous questions, and invariably regarding things about which his emissaries had failed to inquire. At the conclusion of the interview, he inquired our pleasure, asking us whether we wished to remain in his country or if we preferred to return to the outer world, providing it were possible to make a successful return trip across the frozen belt barriers that encircle both the northern and southern openings of the earth. My father replied, "It would please me and my son to visit your country and see your people. your colleges and palaces of music and art, your great fields, your wonderful forests of timber, and after we had this pleasurable privilege, we should try to return to our home on the outside surface of the earth. This son is my only child, and my good wife will be weary awaiting our return. I fear you can never return, replied the chief high priest, because the way is a most hazardous one. However, you shall visit the different countries with Jules Galdea as your escort, and be accorded every courtesy and kindness. Whenever you are ready to attempt a return voyage, I assure you that your boat, which is here on exhibition, shall be put in the waters of the river of Hiddekel at its mouth, and we will bid you Jehovah speed. Thus terminated our only interview with the high priest or ruler of the continent. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video right now because it's already at an hour and 26 minutes. And that doesn't mean I'm not going to continue to read. I don't know if I'm going to put the second video out right away. I hope you guys found this interesting. If there's anything confusing about it, I'm sorry that if I didn't explain the first part really well. I just found it kind of boring, and sometimes they throw in all this stuff, and I'm trying to explain it without, having to read all this other stuff. I just want it to be like a story. So, and let me know about the sound. So, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope you found it interesting. I do believe it gets more interesting. This is basically what I've read so far, so the rest of it is going to be new to me and you. All right. Have a good night or day, guys.